Charlie Kirk backed some of the craziest conspiracy theories in American politics. From pushing the Great Replacement idea, to spreading COVID lies, to fueling election denial, we're exposing the most shocking claims that made him one of the most polarizing figures in the country. And trust me, this gets wild. Kirk's rise to prominence began in his teenage years. Unlike many conservative figures who enter politics after years of professional or academic experience, Kirk skipped college entirely. At just 18, he founded Turning Point USA, a student movement aimed at fighting what he saw as liberal dominance on American campuses. The idea caught fire. Within a decade, TPUSA had grown into a multi-million-dollar nonprofit, boasting chapters across universities and high schools, drawing in young conservatives, and hosting massive events with celebrities of the Republican world. Donald Trump himself embraced Kirk, even giving him front-row seats at rallies and praising his influence on America's youth. For Kirk's followers, this was proof that he was making real change. For his critics, it was evidence of how dangerous unchecked influence can become when combined with loose regard for facts. Kirk's platform was powerful because it wasn't confined to one space. He hosted one of the most listened-to conservative podcasts in the country, commanded a huge following on social media, and appeared on television networks like Fox News. But unlike traditional conservatives, Kirk didn't rely on policy-heavy arguments or academic debate. Instead, he leaned into emotional storytelling, provocative sound bites, and framing opponents as part of a larger, sinister agenda. This is where conspiracy theories began to take center stage. Whether it was immigration, race, public health, or elections, Kirk often advanced claims that exaggerated threats, painted political opponents as enemies of the nation, and turned complex social issues into easy-to-digest narratives of good versus evil. One of the most controversial and defining conspiracy theories that Charlie Kirk promoted throughout his career was the so-called Great Replacement theory. This idea, which has deep roots in far-right and white nationalist movements, claims that global elites, or in some versions, liberal politicians, are deliberately trying to replace the existing white population of Western countries with immigrants, especially from non-European backgrounds. For years, Kirk used his platforms to amplify this narrative, often framing it as a hidden strategy carried out through open border policies, cultural change, and demographic shifts. Kirk openly argued that Democrats were importing immigrants for political gain, saying things like, "The Great Replacement strategy is well underway every single day in our southern border." In his view, immigration wasn't just about people moving across borders. It was part of a coordinated effort to undermine America's traditional culture and, more specifically, its white majority. To his supporters, this was simply an honest observation about demographics and voting patterns. But to critics, Kirk's framing directly echoed white supremacist talking points that had been linked to extremist violence around the world. The Great Replacement theory didn't originate with Kirk, but he helped make it mainstream within American conservative discourse. The theory first gained traction in Europe, pushed by French writer Renaud Camus, and was later picked up by far-right groups across the United States. By the time Kirk embraced it, the theory had already inspired violent acts, including mass shootings in Christchurch, New Zealand, and El Paso, Texas, where gunmen explicitly referenced replacement in their manifestos. This is why so many scholars and watchdog groups sounded alarms when figures like Kirk began repeating the language to millions of followers. They argued that giving such ideas legitimacy from a mainstream conservative platform blurred the line between political rhetoric and radical extremism. What made Kirk's use of the theory especially powerful was the way he connected it to everyday politics. On his podcast, speeches, and campus tours, he often tied immigration debates to cultural survival. He portrayed Democrats as not just wrong on policy, but actively plotting the downfall of America's core identity. He also linked the theory to topics like voter ID laws in sanctuary cities, suggesting that immigrants were being deliberately protected to shift the political balance. This framing turned complex policy issues into a simple and emotionally charged narrative. They are replacing you. fact-checkers and political scientists repeatedly debunked these claims. Studies have shown that demographic changes in the U.S. are influenced by a variety of social and economic factors, not secret conspiracies. Moreover, while immigration does affect population trends, there is no evidence of a coordinated plan to replace anyone. But for Kirk's audience, these criticisms often fell flat. In fact, when the media called the Great Replacement Theory a conspiracy, Kirk used it as proof that the establishment was trying to silence him. This dynamic is what made his rhetoric so polarizing. The very act of being called out only strengthened his credibility among those who already distrusted mainstream institutions. If there was one battlefield Charlie Kirk repeatedly returned to, it was the American university. From the very beginning of his career, Kirk framed college campuses as ground zero for a cultural war, claiming that students were being indoctrinated by professors pushing left-wing ideologies. To him, higher education wasn't just leaning liberal. It was deliberately hostile to conservatives, Christianity, and American traditions. This framing set the stage for another conspiracy-laden narrative he embraced: the idea of cultural Marxism. The term cultural Marxism has a complicated history, but in Kirk's hands, it became shorthand for a secret ideological project supposedly designed to destroy Western civilization from within. He often argued that liberal professors and activists were working to erode traditional values, break down family structures, and replace patriotism with guilt. In speeches, Kirk described universities as islands of totalitarianism, where dissenting voices were silenced and conservative students were persecuted. According to him, everything from diversity programs to gender studies wasn't about education, but about advancing a hidden agenda rooted in Marxist philosophy. This message resonated deeply with his audience, especially young conservatives who felt outnumbered or marginalized in their classrooms. Kirk's Turning Point USA capitalized on this sentiment by organizing campus chapters, publishing Professor Watch Lists, and hosting speaking tours with names like Exposing Critical Racism. These initiatives claim to highlight liberal bias, but they also create a narrative of constant victimhood, that conservative students were soldiers in a broader war against a cultural enemy, plotting America's downfall. But what exactly did Kirk mean by cultural Marxism? In his telling, it was the idea that Marxist thinkers, after failing to spark an economic revolution in the West, shifted their focus to cultural institutions. Universities, Hollywood, the media, even churches, these, he said, became the new battlegrounds. Instead of class struggle, the fight was now about race, gender, sexuality, and identity. In Kirk's view, concepts like feminism, LGBTQ rights, and multiculturalism weren't organic social movements, but deliberate tools designed to weaken traditional Western society. Critics, however, argue that cultural Marxism is itself a conspiracy theory. Many scholars point out that while Marxist thought did influence some intellectual traditions, the idea of a coordinated secret plan to infiltrate institutions has no basis, in fact. They trace the popularity of the term to far-right propaganda, where it has been used to vilify progressive movements and, in some cases, fuel anti-Semitic tropes. In fact, many historians note that cultural Marxism functions less as a serious theory and more as a rhetorical weapon. It lumps together a wide range of social changes and blames them all on an imagined enemy. When the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the world in 2020, most political leaders and commentators found themselves navigating uncharted territory. For Charlie Kirk, however, the crisis quickly became another stage for his war against what he saw as corrupt elites and dishonest institutions. Instead of focusing on scientific consensus, Kirk used his platform to spread doubt, amplify fringe theories, and portray the pandemic as a political weapon designed to hurt conservatives. His approach to COVID-19 became one of the clearest examples of how he blended political activism with conspiracy-driven messaging. From the early days of the pandemic, Kirk was skeptical of public health measures. he repeatedly downplayed the severity of the virus, suggesting that the threat was exaggerated by Democrats and the media to weaken Donald Trump's presidency. On his podcast and social media, he mocked mask mandates, questioned lockdowns, and insisted that social distancing rules were less about safety and more about political control. In one widely shared statement, he claimed that Democrats want to see the American economy fail so they can win an election. To his supporters, this confirmed their suspicion that COVID restrictions were about power, not health. Kirk also championed unproven treatments. He declared that hydroxychloroquine was 100% effective, citing anecdotes and selective reports even after major medical studies debunked its effectiveness and warned of risks. He accused the World Health Organization of covering up information and suggested that Chinese officials were lying about the virus's origins. In some episodes, he went further, describing the pandemic as part of a broader globalist agenda, hinting that elites were exploiting the crisis to consolidate power and push socialist policies. These claims weren't just fringe rants. Kirk had millions of listeners and followers, and his words carried weight in conservative circles. Young audiences especially turned to him for guidance in a time of uncertainty. For many, he offered an alternative narrative, one where fear of the virus was manufactured, where treatments were being suppressed for political reasons, and where following restrictions meant surrendering freedom. This message resonated with those already distrustful of government and media, reinforcing a worldview in which Kirk was the truth teller exposing lies. The consequences were significant. Fact-checking organizations and health experts repeatedly flagged his claims as false or misleading. Social media platforms even took action. Twitter at one point removed some of his posts for spreading COVID misinformation. But Kirk turned these warnings into fuel for his message. He told his audience that censorship proved he was right, that the establishment was trying to silence inconvenient truths. This created a cycle where debunking his claims only deepened his followers' loyalty. If there was one moment that defined Charlie Kirk's place in American politics, it was the 2020 presidential election. When Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump, the country faced an avalanche of misinformation and conspiracy theories claiming the election had been stolen. Charlie Kirk was not just a bystander in this storm. He was one of its most enthusiastic participants. Through his podcast, Turning Point USA events, and appearances on conservative media, he amplified election denialism in ways that shaped the mindset of millions of young conservatives. From the very beginning, Kirk cast doubt on the results. Even before all ballots were counted, he insisted that Democrats were trying to rig the outcome. He repeated Trump's claims of widespread voter fraud, alleging that mail-in ballots were being manipulated and that voting machines had been tampered with. On his platforms, he framed Biden's win as illegitimate, telling audiences that America was witnessing the largest act of voter fraud in history. Turning Point USA quickly became part of the infrastructure supporting these claims. The organization mobilized students and activists in swing states, holding rallies and Stop the Steal-style events. Kirk's team produced content suggesting that young conservatives had a duty to defend democracy by questioning the results. In his speeches, he didn't just question the integrity of voting systems. He portrayed the election as a cultural war, where losing meant the destruction of American values. The problem was that the claims Kirk promoted had little evidence. Court after court dismissed fraud lawsuits due to lack of proof. State election officials, including Republicans, confirmed the results as accurate. Even Trump-appointed judges rejected conspiracy theories about Dominion voting machines and ballot dumping. But Kirk rarely acknowledged these realities. Instead, he leaned into narratives that questioned the very foundations of the system. If critics pointed out the lack of evidence, he accused them of being part of the cover-up. If fact-checkers debunked his claims, he said they were silencing him. In this way, denialism became self-sustaining. It was immune to correction. Charlie Kirk's commentary on race was another area where his rhetoric drew both massive support and fierce criticism. Central to his message was the rejection of the idea of white privilege. While academics and social activists argued that systemic racism gave advantages to white Americans, Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss an update. Also, drop a comment below. Do you think voices like Kirk strengthened democracy by challenging institutions or weakened it by spreading conspiracy?